Officer Dennis Pruitt walked into Courtroom 14B of the Cuyahoga County Justice Center in Cleveland, Ohio, at 4:51 p.m. on a Thursday, and told the black woman standing at the defense table to step outside. He said it in the voice men use when they are not expecting to be questioned, flat, declarative, addressed to the room rather than to her specifically. The way you address furniture you need moved. The woman he said it to was 5 feet 4 inches tall, 49 years old, wearing a black judicial robe over a white blouse and flat shoes that she had owned for 6 years. She had a pen in her right hand and a case file open on the table, because she had come down from the bench 30 seconds earlier to examine an exhibit the defense attorney had produced at the last moment of the day's session. The courtroom was not empty. Court Officer Darnell Gibbs was at his station near the door. A law clerk named Priya Vasquez was at the side table with a laptop. The court reporter, a woman named Janet Fitch, was still at her station with her fingers above the keys. Officer Dennis Pruitt looked at the black woman in the robe and told her to step outside. She looked up from the exhibit. She looked at Pruitt. Then she looked at Darnell Gibbs, who was already standing up from his chair near the door, and she looked back at Pruitt and said, in the voice of someone who has spoken from a bench for 16 years and does not raise it, "Officer, this is an active courtroom. I am the presiding judge. What is your business here?" Pruitt said, "Ma'am, I need you to step out into the hall." He had not looked at the bench. He had not looked at the nameplate on the bench, which read, Honorable Nkechi Okafor, Judge, Cuyahoga County Court of Common Pleas. He had not looked at the robe. He had looked at the face. She said, "I'll ask you once more. What is your business in my courtroom?" The courtroom had the specific quality of air that forms when people in a room stop moving, the overhead light humming its single low note, the faint smell of carpet cleaner and old wood, and the particular stillness of a space that has heard many difficult things and absorbed them all into its walls. The clock above the gallery read 4:52. Janet Fitch had not moved her hands from the keys. Pruitt moved toward her. He placed his hand, not gripping but placing, the gesture of a man who has decided that his hand is an argument, on the upper arm of the judicial robe, and applied enough pressure to indicate direction, toward the door. Janet Fitch's fingers came down on the keys. His name was Dennis Pruitt. He was 38 years old, 11 years on the Cleveland Police Department, currently assigned to the Justice Center building security detail. He was white, 6 feet 2, with a jaw that had never, in 11 years, learned to relax while he was on duty. He had a written commendation in his file from 2019 for de-escalation during a defendant transport incident. He had also, in those same 11 years, had 7 incidents logged in the department's internal system involving members of the public or courthouse staff, 6 of them involving women, 5 of them involving black people. None of them resulting in formal discipline. He did not know who Nkechi Okafor was. He knew she was a black woman in the vicinity of a courtroom he had been tasked with clearing because the building's facilities manager had sent a notice at 4:45 p.m. that the 11th and 14th floors were needed for an HVAC inspection, beginning at 5 p.m. He had been clearing rooms for 20 minutes. He had cleared a conference room, 2 attorneys' offices, and a jury deliberation room. He had not, in those 20 minutes, read a nameplate, looked at a robe, or considered the possibility that the person he was clearing had any standing he was required to respect. That was the whole of his reasoning. That was the mechanism of it, not malice calculated in advance, but the particular inattention that produces the same outcome as malice. The refusal to look at what is right in front of you because looking would require a recalibration you do not want to make. His name was on the court reporter's transcript at 4:51:38 p.m. And so was his badge number, and so was what he said and what she said, and what his hand did, because Janet Fitch had 22 years of professional muscle memory, and her fingers came down the moment he opened his mouth. Her name was Nkechi Okafor. She was 49 years old, and she had been a judge in Cuyahoga County for 16 years, appointed at 33, the youngest woman and the second black judge ever appointed to the common pleas bench in the county's history. Before the bench, she had been an assistant public defender for 7 years, then a public defender supervising 18 attorneys, and in that time, she had stood in 31 different courtrooms in 8 jurisdictions, and she had learned the grammar of power in those rooms, The way you learn a language when your survival depends on it. Not from books, but from constant immersion, constant practice, constant attention to the distance between what the law said and what actually happened to the person standing before it. She was 112 pounds. She had cut her hair close 2 years ago, after her mother died, because her mother had worn her hair close for 40 years, and Nkichi had wanted to carry that forward into her own face. She wore stud earrings, small, gold. Her mother's, from a jewelry box that now sat on the second shelf of her chambers bookcase between the Ohio Revised Code annotated volume and a framed photograph of the 3 children. She had a particular smell in chambers by late afternoon, black tea and something like warm cedar from the wood of the bench, and faintly, the lavender hand cream she kept in the top left drawer and used twice a day, morning and after lunch, and her law clerks over the years had associated that combination of smells with the specific quality of focused attention that meant she was about to produce something worth reading. She had a habit, during particularly difficult rulings, of pressing the flat of her thumbnail against the inside of her left wrist for 3 seconds before she spoke. A gesture so small that only Priya had ever noticed it, and only mentioned it once. She had 3 children, a daughter at Spelman College studying pre-law, a son in his final year of high school who wanted to study architecture, and a 9-year-old who had recently discovered that his mother's job meant she knew a lot about what rules were and who got to make them, which had led to a series of dinner-table conversations she would not have traded for anything. She drove a 2019 Subaru Outback with 91,000 miles on it, and an NPR decal on the rear bumper. She kept a thermos of black tea on the bench every morning. She had never been late to court in 16 years. She had also been stopped by police in her judicial robe twice before this afternoon, once in the parking structure of the Justice Center, once in the lobby, and on both occasions she had been asked to explain herself in a tone that suggested the explanation was unlikely to be sufficient. On both occasions the officer involved had looked at her robe only after she had identified herself, and on both occasions the recognition had arrived in the officer's face as a specific kind of discomfort that she had learned to read clearly and to file away. She had never filed a formal complaint. She had noted both incidents in a private journal she kept in the bottom drawer of her chambers desk, with the date, the officer's name if she had gotten it, and a 2-sentence description of what had occurred. The journal had 11 entries over 16 years. She had begun it the week she was appointed, on the advice of a retired judge named Adelaide Mensah, who was 78 years old, and who had told her, "You will need the record more than you think, and you will never regret having it. If this is already sitting somewhere in your chest, stay. Because what happens between 4:51 p.m. Thursday and 11:47 p.m. that same night will leave a mark on this courthouse that outlasts everyone in this story." When Pruitt's hand touched her robe, she did not move in the direction of the door. She looked at Darnell Gibbs, who was already at her left shoulder, and she said, "Officer Gibbs, please ask this officer to remove his hand and to identify himself by name and badge number for the court reporter." Darnell Gibbs was 54 years old and had been a court officer in Cuyahoga County for 21 years. He was 6'3" and had a stillness about him that was specific to people who have spent decades managing the temperature of rooms. He stepped between Pruitt and the judge with the particular physicality of someone who is not threatening anything but is simply, undeniably, present. He said to Pruitt quietly, "Name and badge number for the record, please." Pruitt looked at Gibbs. He looked at Janet Fitch at the stenography machine. He removed his hand from the robe. He said his name and his badge number, slowly, in the way a person speaks when they are recalibrating, when the room has turned out to be different from what they assumed, and then he stood still. Nkichi looked at him. She said, "Thank you. Now, what is your business in my courtroom, and who authorized you to enter it during an active session?" Pruitt explained the HVAC notice. He explained it in 3 sentences, and by the 3rd sentence, his voice had changed in the way voices change when a person hears themselves, in a room where their words are being typed as they speak. He finished. The courtroom was quiet except for the sound of Janet's keys. Nkichi said, "Court Officer Gibbs will escort you to the hall. I'll finish reviewing this exhibit and formally adjourn before the floor is available. That should take approximately 8 minutes. Please wait outside." Pruitt went to the hall. Court Officer Gibbs went with him. Nkechi Okafor returned to the exhibit on the table, examined it for the remaining time she needed, made 2 notes in the margin of the case file, and returned to the bench. She formally adjourned at 4:59 p.m. She sat at the bench for an additional 30 seconds after the adjourning statement, long enough for Janet Fitch to complete the record. Then she went to chambers. Priya Vasquez was already there, standing at the small table near the window with 2 mugs of tea and a look on her face that meant she had been listening from the side table and had already thought through the next 4 steps. She was 27 years old and had been Nkechi's law clerk for 18 months and had, in that time, learned to recognize the specific quality of quiet that preceded Nkechi Okafor doing something precise and permanent. Nkechi sat down at her desk. She opened the bottom drawer and took out the journal. She wrote the entry for that day in 7 lines: date, time, location, officer name, badge number, the exact words spoken, the exact physical contact made. She wrote it in the same pen she had been holding when Pruitt walked in. Then she closed the journal and looked at Priya. She said, "Pull his internal file, complaint history, incident logs, everything that's public record for a judicial inquiry. I want it by 6, Priya said. Already requested. She set the second mug of tea on the desk. What Priya pulled in the next 40 minutes was this: 7 incidents logged in the department's internal conduct system over 11 years. The 6 involving women. The 5 involving black people. The notation in the summary review from 2021 that no formal discipline had been imposed because each incident had been determined by the reviewing supervisor to fall within the officer's scope of reasonable judgment. The name of the reviewing supervisor appeared in each of the 5 most recent determinations. It was the same name 5 times, a lieutenant named Gary Harlan, 14 years in the department. Nkechi read the file at her desk. She read it the way she read every file that came to her bench, completely, in order, without pausing at the parts that would be easiest to pause at. She got to the end. She pressed her thumbnail to the inside of her left wrist for 3 seconds. Then she picked up the phone on her desk and called the court administrator's office. She said, "I need an emergency hearing scheduled for tonight. Criminal contempt and use of force in a judicial proceeding. I need the county prosecutor's duty attorney, building security's commanding officer, and a representative from the department's internal affairs division. 10 o'clock, the administrator said. "Judge, that's tonight," she said. 10 o'clock. At 9:47 p.m., Nkechi Okafor walked from her chambers to courtroom 14B in the same robe, the same flat shoes, the same mother's earrings. The courtroom had the specific quality of spaces that are usually full and are now, at night, very quiet. The overhead fluorescents on, the jury box empty, the gallery with 4 people in it, the county prosecutor's duty attorney, the building security commander, an internal affairs lieutenant named Sandra Voss, and in the back row, Darnell Gibbs, who had not been required to come and had come anyway. Pruitt was at the defense table with the union representative beside him. He was out of uniform. He had been off shift since 6, wearing dark jeans and a gray button-down, and an expression of controlled uncertainty. He had been told, at 7:30 p.m., that there was an emergency hearing. He had been told the charge. He had called the union, and the union had sent a representative named Carl Peterson, who had been doing this for 20 years, and who had told Pruitt in the hallway outside, "Say nothing, let me do the talking. This will be over by midnight." Janet Fitch was at her station. It was 9:52 p.m., and she was there because Nkechi had called her personally at 6:30 and asked, and Janet had said, "I'll be there," and had driven back downtown in the dark and made herself a cup of coffee from the machine in the hall and sat down at her station and put her fingers above the keys. Nkechi took the bench at 9:58 p.m. She set her thermos of tea to the right of the nameplate. She opened the case file. She looked at the courtroom. She said, "This hearing concerns an incident occurring in this courtroom at 4:51 p.m. today, in which a uniformed officer of the Cleveland Police Department, on building security assignment, entered an active judicial proceeding, addressed the presiding judge in a manner inconsistent with the decorum and authority of the court, and made physical contact with the presiding judge without legal justification. The officer has been identified as Dennis Pruitt. badge number 7741, assigned to the Justice Center security detail. The transcript of the incident, prepared in real time by court reporter Janet Fitch, is entered into the record. Carl Peterson started to stand, and Kichi said, "You'll have an opportunity to be heard, Mr. Peterson." "Not yet." He sat down. She said, "Lieutenant Voss, your office received notification of this incident at 5:47 p.m. today. I have your response acknowledging receipt. I'd like to know the status of Officer Pruitt's conduct history review in light of the 7 prior incident logs in your department system." Sandra Voss was 46 years old, 16 years in the department, and she had read Priya's document request at 6:15 p.m. and spent 40 minutes reviewing the file herself. She said, "We have opened a formal administrative investigation, Your Honor. It was opened at 8:30 this evening." And Lieutenant Harlan, whose name appears as the reviewing supervisor on 5 of the 7 prior determinations. Voss paused for 2 seconds. "Lieutenant Harlan has been notified of the inquiry and has been placed on administrative leave pending review." The union representative opened his mouth, and Kichi said, "Mr. Peterson," he said, "Your Honor, Officer Pruitt was performing a legitimate building management function and had no way of Mr. Peterson," she said, "Officer Pruitt entered an active judicial proceeding without authorization and placed his hand on a sitting judge. The transcript documents this. The court reporter who prepared it is in this room. I am not conducting a trial tonight. I am conducting a contempt inquiry under Ohio Revised Code 2705.02, which I am authorized to initiate in my own courtroom regarding conduct occurring in my presence." She looked at him. "You had something to add?" Peterson sat down. She ruled at 11:14 p.m. contempt of court. The ruling was 6 pages. It cited Ohio Revised Code 2705.02, subsections A and C. It cited the transcript timestamp of 4:51:38 p.m. It cited the physical contact, Pruitt's hand on the judicial robe, as direct contempt occurring in the presence of the court. It imposed a fine of $2,500, mandatory sensitivity and judicial authority training to be completed within 60 days, and a formal recommendation to the department's command staff and Internal Affairs Division that Pruitt's conduct history be reviewed for a pattern of conduct inconsistent with professional standards, with specific attention to the prior determination signed by Lieutenant Gary Harlan. It was the last section of the ruling that did the work that outlasted the fine. The recommendation was public record. It named the 5 incidents. It named the supervisor. It named the dates. It was filed in the court record at 11:23 p.m. and available on the public docket at 11:47 p.m. On the same Thursday, it had begun at 4:51. The Cleveland Plain Dealer had a courthouse reporter named Theo Asamoah, who checked the docket every night at 11 before he filed his last update. He saw the filing at 11:52 p.m. He read the ruling in full. He called his editor at 11:58 p.m. The story ran online at 6:14 a.m. Friday, with the headline intact and the transcript excerpt in the 3rd paragraph. By 9 a.m. Friday, the department's public affairs office had issued a statement. By 10:30, the union had issued a counter-statement. By noon, the Cuyahoga County Bar Association had issued a 3rd statement, which was the shortest and the most specific. It named the ruling, it cited the statute, and it noted that the presiding judge had acted entirely within her authority. Gary Harlan resigned from the department on the following Tuesday, citing personal reasons. The formal investigation into his conduct history, which Sandra Voss's office opened the morning after the hearing, was ongoing at the time of his resignation and did not close with it. It moved forward. That is how investigations work when they are built on documents, rather than on the cooperation of the person being investigated. Pruitt completed the mandatory training. He paid the fine. He was reassigned from the Justice Center to a precinct desk in the eastern part of the city. The reassignment was not named in any public document as a consequence of the ruling. It was described in the department's internal communication as a routine rotation. Darnell Gibbs, who had been a court officer in this building for 21 years, read the rotation notice on the staff bulletin board and said nothing. He had been present for what happened. He understood the distance between what things were called and what they were. And Kechi Okafor was on the bench at 9 a.m. the following Monday. black tea in the thermos, mother's earrings, flat shoes, a new case file. The courtroom was the same courtroom, the same bench, the same gallery, the same nameplate reading Honorable Nkechi Okafor, Judge, Cuyahoga County Court of Common Pleas. And it was also not the same, in the way rooms are not the same after something has been named in them that was previously left unnamed. There is a specific thing that happens when you refuse to be made invisible in a room that was designed for your authority. It is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. A woman returns to her exhibit, makes 2 notes in the margin, formally adjourns. She goes to chambers. She opens a drawer. She writes 7 lines in a journal with the same pen she was holding when the door opened. She calls a law clerk who has already thought through the next 4 steps. She makes the record and she makes it complete, and she schedules the hearing for the same night because the courthouse is still open, and the statute does not require her to wait. What she did not do is equally important. She did not cry in her chambers. She did not call her husband and tell him what had happened before she finished the work. She did not let the 11 other entries in that journal tell her that this entry was inevitable, that nothing would change, that the record was a private grief rather than a tool. She had kept the journal for 16 years, on the advice of a retired judge who had kept her own journal for longer than that, and she had learned what that judge had learned before her. The record is not for the moment you write it. It is for the moment someone reads it, and you cannot know, when you are writing, how close that moment is. You cannot keep a record for only the occasions when you believe it will be received. You keep it because the alternative is allowing the thing to pass as if it did not happen, and what passes as if it did not happen becomes the normal. The normal is built from what is not named. Name it. Write it down. Write the date, the time, the badge number, and what the hand did. Write it in the same pen you were holding when the door opened. The journal in the bottom drawer of your desk is not a record of everything that has been done to you. It is a record of everything you refuse to let disappear. Nkechi Okafor drinks her tea before every session. She is on the bench at 9 a.m. She has not been late in 16 years. Her daughter calls from Spelman on Sunday evenings to tell her about her evidence class. Her 9-year-old has been asking lately about the difference between rules and laws, why some rules have consequences and some don't, who decides, what happens when the person making the rules breaks them. She tells him, somebody has to be watching, and whoever is watching has to write it down. He thinks about this. He is 9 years old, and he thinks about it with the particular seriousness of children who are being handed something before they understand what it is. She lets him think. Here is what I want you to carry with you when this is over. Somewhere in your life, there is a drawer. Maybe it does not have a journal in it yet. Maybe it has never needed one. But I want you to think about the people who told you, before you understood why, that the record matters. Who gave you that? A grandmother, a teacher, a neighbor. Someone who had already lost something and did not want you to lose it the same way. And I want you to ask yourself honestly, are you keeping the record they taught you to keep? Leave your answer in the comments. I want to know who taught you to write it down. Subscribe for more stories about hidden strength, quiet power, and the people the world overlooks until they change everything. I'll see you in the next one.